and welcome to a special episode of the Electorate Podcast. I am your host, Ian West, and today I was not originally going to do an episode. I was going to get to the other side of the Thanksgiving holiday and really dive into the newly announced Trump tariffs. But I had the misfortune of having listened to the most recent episode of Pod Save America. And on that episode, they had, well, it was called Top Harris Campaign Staff Tell Us What Went Wrong in the 2024 Election. And this sort of piqued my interest a little bit. You know, I didn't expect it to be a particularly hard-hitting interview. It was Dan Pfeiffer leading the way for Pod Save America. He was in Washington, met with Jen O'Malley Dillon, David Plouffe, Quentin Fulks, and Stephanie Cutter. And, you know, the expectation was that it would be pretty softball. I don't think, that they would have taken the interview if it wasn't going to be some sort of safe space where they weren't going to be pushed too hard. They were going to be able to kind of explain it in their terms. And Dan Pfeiffer definitely let them do that. And that was sort of the expectation. That was fine. But I did expect a lot more than what we got. Okay. So, and my advice is to listen to or watch the episode yourself. Come to your own conclusions, make your own opinions of it. But in my personal opinion, it's an hour and 35 minutes long, and it is patently evident that they learned nothing. They learned zero from this campaign. So it's pretty apparent from the outset as this episode begins. And it's mostly a back and forth with Pfeiffer, David Plouffe, and Jen O'Malley Dillon. And from the outset, they deflect questions. They sort of refuse to accept blame. They make excuses. Every decision that they made was the right one. They don't feel like they had any missteps. They keep reverting back to the fact that the campaign was short. It was just over 100 days. And it basically shows that they learned absolutely nothing. Okay. And yes, the campaign was tough. The campaign was short. You had to separate yourself from the, the Biden administration, which was at the time deeply unpopular. We know all this. But you have to understand, as campaign staffers, high-level campaign staffers for a presidential election that raised like $1 billion, you can't lose all 7 swing states. It's not acceptable. And not only did they lose all 7 swing states, they lost deep blue states. They lost massive advantages in them. In New York and California, they lost these advantages there, lost all 7 swing states. You made mistakes. You need to understand them. And the fact that they're not doing any sort of self-analysis or introspection or second-guessing any decision they made shows me that not one of these individuals should be in charge of a high-level Democratic campaign in the future. It's extremely frustrating to see because right after the election, it seemed like everybody was sort of on this, okay, Democrats are learning that the campaign landscape has changed from 2008, 2012, even 2016. We have shifted way into a different era, and this election is proof of that. And then, a week goes by and you start seeing more and more people on Twitter and TikTok and Reddit and wherever you find sort of influencers and people offering up their opinions started to kind of walk that back a little bit and started to kind of be like, well, what do you do with misinformation, right? How do you combat this? How do we change our messaging to these things are still important to us. The things that we're saying, the American doesn't care about are still important to us. How do we just abandon those ideals and all that? And, at the time, a couple episodes, I said, okay, these are not campaign staffers, right? These are not high-level Democratic strategists. These are not, big-time talking heads in the Democratic Party. So, we need to make sure that those people learn. Then this episode comes out, and it is clear that not one of these individuals views anything that was done during the Harris campaign as a mistake. They nothing but excuses, nothing but reasons, nothing but self-justification for every decision they made being exactly the right one. David Plouffe sort of halfway accuses the Trump campaign of campaign finance, breaking campaign finance laws with the super PACs. I think both him and Jen O'Malley Dillon complain about, and Sarah Cutter, I believe, complained about it. Stephanie Cutter complained about it a little bit as well, saying that it was not the super PACs that Trump had made it to where it wasn't fair. They didn't have this ecosystem like Trump did, and blah blah blah. This campaign raised $1 billion fucking dollars. Okay, that is not an acceptable criticism. You had all the money in the world to spend to get whatever result you wanted, and you did the wrong things. The question about podcasts came up, and not just Joe Rogan, but kind of podcasts in general. The first sort of foray into that is when Pfeiffer talked about sort of the expenses that the Harris campaign incurred. And he sort of, he talked about rebuilding the set to do the Call Her Daddy podcast. And he was sort of implying the same thing with what they spent to do the Oprah show that they did. And Jen O'Malley Dillon didn't answer the question directly. She kind of deflected on it and, didn't have this excuse or had this excuse. A hurricane came through, so that changed their time frame a little bit. She had to do some other stuff. True. Okay, that's fine. But that sort of kicked off the podcast conversation, and it eventually made its way around to the one that everybody has been talking about since this happened, and that's the Joe Rogan podcast. Why didn't you go on the Joe Rogan podcast? Were you invited? Were you asked to come on? And their response was yes. We had conversations with Joe Rogan's team about putting this together, about coming on the podcast, same as Donald Trump, and, whether they use that to, whether they leverage the Harris campaign to get Trump on, they didn't know. My assumption is probably yes. Their assumption is probably the same. But when first asked about it, and Pfeiffer asks Stephanie Cutter directly about this, and you can see Jen O'Malley Dillon there smirking at this question, and you can tell she has opinions on it and scoffing at it, and she kind of keeps her mouth shut there at first and lets Stephanie respond, and the crux of the response was that, well, there was a few reasons. First they make it clear that that podcast wasn't going to move the needle. It wasn't going to change the outcome of the election. Okay, maybe not. But this is just one piece of a puzzle. This is one part of a series of decisions that we feel like you made incorrectly. So this is one step into that, for us to understand why these decisions were made. So Stephanie goes on to talk about, and Plouffe backs her up on it, and Jen O'Malley Dillon does as well, that this was not something that was going to move the needle in the election. Okay, fine. If that's your opinion, that's your opinion, and that's you're free to have it. Another was, and this one is one that just absolutely baffled me. So they started whining about the amount of time that they had in the campaign again. Oh, we just didn't have time. We didn't have time. And their response was that they did not. Getting to Austin, Texas is hard. Okay. They just couldn't find the time to get there. This is $1 billion campaign. Okay. This is the vice president of the United States of America. You could find a way to get to Austin, Texas to do this podcast, something that is going to reach an audience a massive audience that you might never otherwise have reached. If you can pull the strings and drop the cash to rebuild the Call Her Daddy podcast studio, which reached, 10% of Rogan's audience or something like that, you can find a way to get to Austin. And Dan Pfeiffer brings up the fact that they went to Houston for what he called the Beyonce rally. And you can tell they kind of got sheepish on that. They kind of were like, well, oh, yeah, but that was like a better use of our time. That was a rally. That was, a way to get out the message, blah, blah, blah. And you can, and this is just, to me, it is further evidence that they just did not and do not still understand the changing landscape of United States campaigns. They talked about the Hot Ones podcast, and they were like, there's probably never been a candidate built better for the Hot Ones podcast than Kamala Harris. Just her bright smile, her joyous personality. And why didn't you go on that? Well, they didn't want us to talk about, they wouldn't let us talk about politics, no politics on Hot Ones. Okay. And the fact that they couldn't see this is interesting to me. It's a lot of people vote for a candidate that they just fucking like. Hot Ones has a huge audience. This would have been the perfect opportunity for Kamala Harris. And if your messaging is, and we'll get to this in just a minute too, if your messaging is that I am different from the Biden administration, I am different from Donald Trump, this would have been the perfect opportunity to showcase yourself as just a fucking person, somebody that is just relatable and perhaps and almost likely, if someone was not familiar with Kamala Harris, watch some clips from Hot Ones, and they all produce these sound bites. They all produce these clips. We've all seen the Paul Rudd, the clip, we've all seen the Idris Elba clip. We've all seen the Sydney Sweeney clip. Like these are things that resonate with audiences. And if somebody saw Kamala Harris, picked out one of these clips and put it on social media, and somebody saw that, they might then go out and figure out, okay, who is Kamala Harris? I kind of liked her. She seemed like a real person. And how many people have told you that that's the reason they vote for Donald Trump? Because he's just a fucking dude, that they feel like he's just a guy. They feel like he's not political establishment. And how do you create that mentality? You do it by showcasing the person, not necessarily just the candidate. So it baffles my mind that, and presumably every single one of these people makes a lot of money and has access to a seemingly infinite amount of research, how they are still trying to run a campaign like it's 2008 or 2012. And maybe David Plouffe is just still so, maybe he's just still so stuck in that Obama era that he can't move it forward, and Jen O'Malley Dillon just following right along. But it's fascinating to me that they just missed the mark so badly on this and acted like they didn't have time. Like, you have 100 days, and I get that's a short time frame, and you don't want to waste time. If you don't want to waste time, then don't parade fucking Liz Cheney around at all these events. Spend that time doing something that's going to resonate with voters. How many people are going to switch their vote or decide who they're going to vote on because Liz fucking Cheney supported a candidate? It's not going to happen. Those people don't exist. That's not a real portion of the electorate. The Obama administration, that is not how you run an election anymore. And yes, though, that era of politician shifting, say you get enough of those people and they're like, okay, yeah, we're never Trumpers, we'll never support him, we support, holistically and as an aggregate, yeah, that's good, that's fine. You want those endorsements, you want to put those in ads and things like that, but not parade them around at rallies, specifically in crunch time. We are week from the election, and she is still on the campaign trail with Kamala Harris. Get yourself to one of these massive podcasts. Get yourself out there. Show people who you are, not this contrived rally setting. And don't tell me it's because it's fucking hard to get there. Don't tell me it's because you didn't have enough time to get there. We spent weeks, and they scoffed at this notion as well of people saying, she's not doing enough interviews. She's not doing enough interviews. She fucking wasn't. That is just an objective fact. And you said from the beginning that our primary goal with Kamala Harris is introducing her to the people who don't know who she is. So why did it take you so long to start doing that? You wasted weeks. I understand you have to craft your message. You've got to plan a convention. Honestly, the Democratic National Convention was going to be a fucking slam dunk no matter what. This is the safest, environment in which you can exist as a Democratic candidate. Who the fuck cares, right? This is a special scenario. Don't waste your time doing this. Start getting out there. Stay up all night, work all day, craft your message so that you can at least start doing some things right off the bat. You wasted time not doing that and then ran out of time at the end, according to you, to be able to do the things that were more important. So if your number one goal was to introduce her, not just as a candidate, but as a person, you failed across the board. You started too late, and then you didn't get her in the right environments. Rallies are not the right environments, okay? This is not how you successfully, get this is not how you successfully introduce a candidate. They also brought up the quote-unquote anti-trans ad, which we can all sit here and argue until we're blue in the face. Personally, I don't think this was an anti-trans ad, and I think a lot of people agree with this. We've talked about it a little bit before. The ad was essentially, and if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you all have, or at least are familiar with the premise of it. It is an ad that basically says, it talks about approving gender reassignment surgeries for illegal immigrants in prison. And a lot of people view that as an anti-trans ad. A lot of they calling it an anti-trans ad. That's not really, to me, what it was. Okay, it's an anti-immigration ad, and it is an economic ad. And yes, it kind of touches on something that Democrats are involved in identity politics. They're all about identity politics. So it is a callback to that, but that is not the crux of the argument. What the ad was designed to do was say, hey, while you're out there, spending this much on eggs or this much on gas or this much on whatever it might be, Democrats are using taxpayer dollars to do elective gender reassignment surgeries for someone who's not even an American citizen. Okay, it's anti-immigration sentiment, but it's economic sentiment first and foremost. They are wasting your dollars doing something that doesn't. This is, if you ask the electorate this, if you ask your average voter this is not important. And they could have also said they're using taxpayer dollars to do facial plastic surgery on an illegal immigrant. I agree. Plastic surgery is not quite the trigger point that the transgender argument is. But again, the crux of that is wasting taxpayer money on, somebody who's not even a United States citizen. So they talk about that ad a little bit, and it's Quentin Fulks who kind of talks about the way that was resonating with audiences, and their data showed that wasn't really resonating with audiences. That wasn't really playing out there. And that's just not fucking true. And the fact that they, I still hear people talking about that ad. I still hear people on the right side of the spectrum and in the middle of the spectrum talking about that ad and how it kind of, made sense to them. It's something that they still remember today. That's what you want. And okay, that memorable soundbite, that thing that people just sticks with them, and that was one of them. So the fact that they and whether or not, I'm not saying he's lying about that their data was showing them otherwise, but I am saying that this was a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of how successful that ad was being, and it just kind of. It kind of lends back to just, it seemed disjointed. They seemed like, and I mentioned this to somebody else who watched the podcast. They sort of disagreed with me on it. But at the beginning in particular, Dan Pfeiffer asked them the question, was there any moment during the campaign, either during the 100 days, the 100 plus days, or on campaign night that was finally like, okay, we're not doing too well. Jen O'Malley Dillon didn't really answer this question directly. She didn't answer a lot of questions directly. She started talking about how they knew Florida was going to be bad, right? They knew they were going to lose vote share in California and in New York. And none of that was a surprise. They knew it. It was all calculated, blah, blah, blah. But they talked about the campaign, and, they said one of the hot points that a lot of people were saying is that it was kind of a margin of error election. But, and it was very close. It's down to 1.6 points right now, nationally. All these battleground states were very close. Everything was close, yes, 100%. I do not disagree with that at all. Trump's increase of his electorate was broad, but it was shallow, right? And this is not sort of a mandate for Trump. This election was not a mandate for Trump to, a statement win or anything like that. He got broad, but very, very, very shallow. But they started talking about the internal polling data, particularly in a lot of the swing states. And, they were like, oh, we were reading these polls that were basically saying, oh, we're up 2 or 3 or 4 points or this or that. And they were like, no, it was never that. It was like 47-48 Trump, 46-47, blah, blah, blah. And it kind of became clear to me, at least, and they didn't state this outright, but it seemed like she was trying to hold it back, that all their internal polling showed them losing. And yes, technically, a point or two, you're within the margin of error, right? But if all of your data shows you losing the election week after week after week after week, it's probably an indicator that you're not doing well. And I think they knew this. And that, to me, makes it even more unforgivable that they didn't change their strategy, that they didn't view these final weeks where they could have done the Joe Rogan podcast, or they could have, done Hot Ones or something else. Or why did they stop Tim Walz from going out there and being Tim Walz, like the dude, the dad? It seems like they just made misstep after misstep, and they are 100% unwilling to admit that they did anything wrong. Every decision was correct. They haven't second-guessed a single thing. Every choice they made was the right choice. So why did you lose? Why did you lose not just the election, but every single swing state? Why did you hemorrhage vote share in Democratic strongholds? Why did you lose nearly every demographic, nearly every county in the country? You had $1 billion. You had, in my opinion, a good candidate, good enough to win, specifically when the other candidate seems hell-bent on just tanking himself. You have to have some sort of introspection. You have to have some sort of ability to look at what you did. And I wasn't expecting her to come on and be like, look, we fucked this whole thing up. This was it was a mess. We did everything wrong. No, you did a lot of good stuff, for sure. And yes, the expectation was that this would be a softball interview, and it was. That's fine. But I expected some level of mea culpa from one of them, okay? I expected some sort of, in hindsight, I wish we would have done this, or in hindsight, I wish we would have treated this differently, or I wish we would have gotten her started with interviews sooner, or I wish we would have done the Joe Rogan podcast. In hindsight, that made more sense, but there was none of that. And if I'm running a press, and I don't think this is a good idea, but some reports have come out lately that Kamala Harris is still considering a run in 2028. With more time in this election, would she have had a better chance? Yeah, maybe. I still think the strategy sucked, but she would have had a better chance. But I think, unfortunately, voters and Democrat voters are going to be very, very upset with the amount of money that was spent, the likelihood that that the campaign might, or the DNC might actually still be in debt after this campaign, despite record-setting donations. I don't think it's a good idea, and we can dig into this later. This is obviously, that's a long way off. That's not super important, but regardless of the candidate, I do not think Jen O'Malley Dillon or David Plouffe should be anywhere near anybody's campaign at all. I do not think that they should be able to touch another campaign. The other two, I had problems with Quentin Fulks and I had problems with Stephanie Cutter's answers. I got a little less of a sense that, they were sort of stuck in their ways. They felt like maybe they could learn or maybe could adapt, but even still, I think this one just went so poorly that I would probably move on from them as well. But absolutely 100% Jen O'Malley Dillon, David Plouffe, nowhere near another campaign again. I mean, it was just, I can forgive losing. I can forgive mistakes. Not being able to be willing to sort of have an introspection or sort of a sit back and look at, okay, this is where we went wrong and we know that now. So for the next campaign, this is what we expect. Because if I put them out there for another campaign, my expectation is they're going to do the same shit over again. And just because you have more time doesn't mean that same shit is going to work. Knocking your head against a wall might eventually punch its way through the wall, but you might knock yourself out before you get there. So, that's all I've got on this. I'm not going to continue belaboring this point. The Democratic Party has a lot to learn. We know that. Everyone else knows that. My expectation was that the people in these positions would know that. I'm a little fearful that they don't. But hopefully candidates who are coming up, particularly in the midterms and then into the next general, are looking at the old school way of running a campaign and realizing that's not how we do it anymore. So that's all I'm going to say on this one today. We will probably be back next week with a very tariff-centric episode. But until then, I will be enjoying my Thanksgiving, and I hope you all do the same. And I will catch you on the next episode of The Electorate. Later, everyone.